All right, guys, so I'm going to be going through part two of your study guide. This part is going to give you probably the most clear detail on exactly what your paper is on. While you will not get the prompt before the day of the test, if you look at this study guide, you should have a good understanding of what this paper is going to be about. Okay, so first thing we need to know is what women were doing during World War II. And women are both going to serve in the military, with 300,000 women serving in the military, and they are also going to be a huge contribution to the workforce. So when we think about positive things that happen for women, there's several different things. One of the biggest things, though, is that women worked a lot in World War II compared to previous time periods. They're going to work in previously unobtainable jobs, such as working in factories. They worked in the military. And a lot of women are going to continue to work even after World War II, which we'll get to in just a second. Now, a negative is going to be that women were still paid less, but that is really it. Women were paid less than men. Now, to convince everyone that they needed to work, or to convince women to work, because actually at this point society had gotten so good at convincing women not to work that they had actually convinced them to go to work, they created an image of a woman working in a factory named Rosie the Riveter. And Rosie the Riveter is this person right here, trying to show that women can go work. So the purpose of this image is to highlight that women can indeed work men's jobs. And I'm using men's in air quotes because this is trying to convince women to go work in the factories. Now, women are going to enjoy this type of work. And so after World War II, a lot of women are going to have to leave these jobs, but it does spark this idea that women should continue to work in the workforce. And this could be seen as a start of the women's rights movement, the second wave feminism. A lot of second wave feminism has to do with breaking old gender norms, which is mainly that women don't need to work. After World War II, it was seen that women could work, and because of that, could be seen as a starting point for the women's rights movement. Now, in discussing things that are good for minorities, there's a lot of good things that happen for minorities as well. Probably the biggest thing that's going to be good is going to be the Fair Employment Act. This is passed in 1941. It was passed under threat of a massive march by Asa Philip Randolph, A. Philip Randolph as well. And A. Philip Randolph, or Asa Philip Randolph, is going to tell FDR that basically black people want to work in the defense industry. And the Fair Employment Act allowed for black people to work in the defense industry for the first time. Other ways that the World War II is going to be good for minorities is going to be the Tuskegee Airmen, which is a good and a bad thing at the same time. The bad thing is, and we'll get to this on the next slide, is that there's still segregation in the military, but the good thing is some black people were able to fight in the war and became heroes for fighting in the war. And this is going to promote equality, because all of a sudden you're seeing that black people are heroes in the war, and the Tuskegee Airmen are definitely the biggest examples of that. Because there is segregation, and because there is still racism in America, the NAACP and CORE are going to be civil rights organizations that are going to either increase their membership, such as the NAACP, and or be created, such as CORE. CORE is created to help fight for equality. And that's why a lot of times World War II is seen as kind of the launching point of the civil rights movement, because it's these actions that are going to cause for these organizations to be created. And finally, farming. Farming is going to be such a massive boom during World War II, because we were producing food for not just the United States, but other countries as well, that 200,000 Mexican immigrants migrated to the United States during this time. So it was a nice job market for Mexican immigrants. All right, now there is bad things as well. So the bad things are going to be military segregation. Black people a lot of times had to work in labor-only platoons or groups of soldiers during World War II. They would be creating the roads, clearing trees and debris, things like that in Europe. This is obviously not very glamorous work, and something that black people were forced to do because of the segregation of the military. Additionally, there were some black soldiers who were mistreated. Even though they're fighting for their country, that are being mistreated. And this actually really bothered Harry Truman. And we're going to talk about Harry Truman next unit, but Harry Truman was incredibly bothered that black people in uniform were still beaten up by white people. And this actually caused for him to eventually desegregate the military, but he did that after World War II because he was not president really during World War II. Next is the Zoot Suit riot. So as you have Mexican immigration taking place in California, Zoot Suits were a type of suit that Mexicans wore in California during this time. And servicemen are going to beat up dozens of Mexican immigrants during World War II, and basically no one came to their defense, showing that segregation and racism is still alive in America, even though we're at war, trying to kind of fight for, freedom of others. And then the last thing, or the last two things are kind of related. You had the Executive Order 9066. This was FDR's executive order, which put all Japanese Americans in internment camps, which were these isolated desert camps, pretty nasty part of American history. They were kept in camps for many years because it was viewed that Japanese Americans might not be loyal to America. They might be loyal to only Japan, even though 2/3 of all Japanese that were put into these camps were born in the United States. They were naturalized American citizens. And to kind of put salt in that wound, Korematsu versus the United States is a Supreme Court case which states that this is actually legal. We are not treading on anyone's constitutional rights, showing that the Supreme Court can still make some of the worst decisions when it comes to racial relations. All right. Now, when it comes to the government during World War II, there is going to be a lot of things that happen. The government's going to get much, 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 much bigger and more powerful. The three biggest ways that I can tell you that it gets more powerful, first is with the War Production Board. The War Production Board is going to be an organization that basically took normal companies and made them stop selling civilian goods and start selling goods for our military. The best example of this would probably be the Ford car company. They stopped creating cars for people and they start making planes and tanks for the military. The National War Labor Board is also going to be created. This is to make sure that there are no strikes anymore in America. And they did this by increasing everyone's wages, including adding a 15% raise on top of whatever you were making to make sure that there weren't strikes. But of course, you might wonder, well, what if there were going to be strikes? That's where the Smith-Connolly Act comes into place. And this may be the most powerful reach of power that the federal government wanted to do, which basically stated that if you do strike, you could have your company taken over. This happened in Philadelphia during World War II. There was a Philadelphia company that is going to go on strike, and FDR is going to threaten to basically put all the people who are on strike in the military, force them into being drafted if they did not go back to work. And that actually did get them to go back to work. So the next thing is going to be rationing. The government is going to hold back certain food supplies and then other things like rubber so that they could make enough materials for the military. Now, they did this in World War I as well. It wasn't nearly as big of a deal in World War I for two big reasons. First is the Great Depression. So basically everyone was so used to not having anything that they kind of just continued to not have anything. Rationing was something that had to be done during the Great Depression out of necessity because you didn't have money. So now that's not that big of a deal. And then there's also these things called victory gardens, which start to be planted. And victory gardens are small personal gardens where you could grow food that you didn't have to go buy at the store. Now, the taxes are going to be incredibly high during World War II. If you look at this chart, you'll see that this massive spike right here is World War I taxes. But you'll see that the lowest tax level is very, very low still. So the poorest Americans aren't really having to pay anything. Well, you go to World War II and you'll see that taxes get even higher than they were in World War I. The highest tax rate was for somebody close to making $2 million in today's money, was taxed at 95%. So what that means is if you made over $2 million, every dollar that you make after $2 million, 95 cents went to the government, you got 5 cents. But what you really want to see too is that the tax rate for the poorest Americans also goes up. That's really the major change, is that in World War I, the poorest people really aren't paying anything. Now all of a sudden, the poorest people are paying a lot more. And then finally, propaganda. We actually talk about this in another section, so I'm not going to really add anything to this, but propaganda was something that World War II governments did, just like World War I, but it was different, but you should already have that down from your section 1.